The door of my classroom opened softly, and the assistant janitor entered my classroom apologetically. "Pardon me, Professor, but there are 2 women in the corridor below who wish to speak to you. They look like mountain women, and they wouldn't state their business to me. I told them you were probably busy." "Oh, it's no problem. I'm not teaching at this hour," I replied. "Show them upstairs, if you will." The clatter of heavy shoes echoed throughout the quiet hallway. In a moment, 2 slatternly women stood hesitant at the threshold of my room. "Mister?" the older and more bolder inquired. "Are you a linkster?" "Beg your pardon, ma'am? Am I a what?" I asked, a bit dazed at the unusual query. "Are you a linkster?" the woman repeated. "We've just come from Lawyer Taylor's office down yonder in town, and he told us you was." "Well, I've been called many things, and if my friend Mr. Taylor says I'm this particular thing, he's probably right. But I think you'll have to at least tell me what this linkster is or what it does." "Why, mister, a linkster's a feller who can read writing and understand talking in a foreign tongue, like Injun or Dutch or something that way." I began to see the light. Linkster? Why, of course. A forgotten Appalachian word I seemed to have known somewhere before. "Why, I'm afraid I'm not the kind you wish," I replied. "I know nothing of Indian tongues and very little of Dutch, though I do know some foreign languages, and I teach them here at this college. But why do you ask?" "Why, mister, we've gotten all bumfuzzled about a letter that come in the mail the other day. It has some kind of writing in it that nobody in Dry Cove can read it. Square Gabby believed it was Dutch or Latin maybe, so I brung it to town and I showed it to Lawyer Taylor, and he said you could interpret it." "Well, possibly I might," I said. "Have you got the letter with you?" "Yes, sir, we've got it," the older woman continued. "Virgie, give it to the man." The girl of probably 20 years pulled a tinted square envelope from her pocket in her long, loose, incredibly old-fashioned coat. The flat voice of the old woman went on. "We was fearful it might be about my boy. He's in the war. His name is John Hilton, and this is his wife, Virgie Hilton." "Oh, I see," as I began to understand, and I took the letter. "This is written in French, and I can read it easily enough. Shall I translate it for you?" "Yes, sir. I reckon that's what you call it. We'd like to know who it's from and what it says." "Well, come in and sit down and I'll read it to you. Then, if you wish, I'll make a copy in English so you can read it for yourselves." "There wouldn't be no necessity of that, mister. Can't nary one of us read no kind of writing and printing. But we can recollect the main idea if you read it off like." I decided to glance first over the letter quietly before I read it aloud. I could tell right away it was from a girl in a tiny village from northern France. It was addressed to the father and the mother of John Hilton, who, at the time of writing, was staying in the home of this French girl's parents. The note had been laboriously but crudely penned, and there were numerous errors of composition, but it was typically and eloquently French. I hastily read through the contents before I read it out loud. Instantly, I saw the situation. Either this simple-minded peasant girl had been dazzled by the glamour and the stalwart of an American man, or the simple-minded mountain man had fallen head over heels in love with her. However, the girl's letter gave it all away. The boy was her lover. He had promised to marry her and bring her to America. To surprise him, she had secretly went through his wallet and found his address home, and she wrote this message to his parents. She loved him very, very much, and she promised she would try very, very hard to be a good wife to him in America. She was praying to God every day that he might be kept from harm in the terrible war. Even the old priest in her village was praying too. She ended the letter by sending 1,000 kisses and her most tender caresses to the dear parents of John, signed sincerely their humble and most dutiful future daughter-in-law, Heloise, my child. I had read through the letter rapidly, partly because if it told of any mishap that might have befallen their son and husband at the front, I might soften somewhat the blow of the bad news to the mother and the wife. But this was something I hadn't prepared for. I wavered back and forth in my head on how to break the news of this letter. Part of me just said, just give it to him straight. Heck, it wasn't no affair of mine anyhow. I merely had been called to render a slight favor to total strangers, whom I probably would never see again. So I reasoned, and I turned in my swivel chair and I read it aloud. But a second glance at the young wife changed my decision in a twinkling. The older woman's face wore that stoical, unreadable expression that the years bring to the hardy mothers of mountain men. But the girl, her large hazel eyes were fixed upon me with wondering, hoping, and agonizing appeal that strangely hid behind the outward calm that she maintained. Despite the heavy overcoat that she was wearing on this warm autumn morning, it was apparent that she was very pregnant, and the baby would be due in just a few weeks, perhaps just a few days. And I held in my hand a letter from a faraway, unknown place, and this was the first news that they had heard from him since he left for the war. There I was, a respected college professor, a deacon in the Presbyterian church. I couldn't bring myself to read this letter as it was written. Instead, this is what I read aloud. Dear friends in America, this is to give you news of your dear son, John Hilton, who for some weeks has been stationed in this village, preparing to be transferred to the front lines. He wishes me to tell you that he is well and happy, and he is being cared for as well as possible in our little home. He speaks of you every day, especially of his father and his mother and his dear young wife. I am praying to God each day that he may be kept from harm from this terrible war. He says if you can find some time to write to him, he can have your letter read by one of his comrades or by the old priest in the village. Signed, with sincere affection, from your unknown friends in France. I am affectionately yours, Heloise Bachald. The contents of the letter, as thus rendered, were eminently satisfactory to the listeners. Even the mother's expressionless face lightened with a smile that exposed two ugly yellow snags in her shrunken mouth, and it threw into startling contrast the singularity of the perfect ivory teeth of the young girl. The inexpressible relief and happiness beamed from every line of the young girl's radiant face, and it made me brazenly feel as perhaps I had done the right thing. She sure writes like a good gal, don't she, Virgie? The mother beamed when I had finished. Yes, and awful religious-like, too. She talks plumb purty. Well, Professor, I reckon we ought to say we're much obliged to you for reading it to us. We're poor folks and we ain't got much. But if you ever get out in them mountains yonder, we'd be real proud for you to drop in. And with the gratitude voiced so eloquently in the crude phrases of bygone days, they stalked out of the room. I watched them as they crossed the campus. Their rustic dress and carriage was made even more conspicuous as they passed a large group of college girls at the gate. My eyes followed their awkward footsteps out of the little city, and I imagined them traveling the dusty miles to back where the Cherokee Range softened into the southern skyline. I couldn't help but feeling a bit proud of my proficiency in the Romance languages, and yet, at the same time, there was one disconcerting fly in the ointment of my complacency, and that was the fear that, in the canny, suspicious way that mountain folk have in their dealings with strangers, should they decide to corroborate my rendering of this strange letter by seeking out the aid of another linkster, I began to blame myself for not having written my translation and substituting it for the original. That way I could have kept the letter in French in my possession. Before long, the incident of the French letter had all been but forgotten in the busy routine of spring semester's work, when one day, around lunch, I was taking a walk along the Maple Line College campus. My attention was drawn to the canvas-covered farm wagon that was passing in the street. I figured it was one of the many wagons from the nearby mountains looking to sell their apples in the market. I passed through the gate and I stopped the driver to see if he had any apples. No, mister, I never brought nary an apple this trip, he replied to my inquiry. I just come to town to do some trading and get the news from the war. You have a son overseas? I asked, divining it from something in the old man's tone. I did have, mister, he said quietly. But Lawyer Taylor, he gave me this paper this morning, and it says my boy is named among the killed. Here's the paper. The lawyer put a mark by his name, and he handed me the folded paper. I saw the name that Lawyer Taylor had checked. John Hilton, Dry Cove, Tennessee. It was then that I remembered. Oh, then it must have been your wife and daughter-in-law who brought me the letter from the young French woman some months ago. Yes, sir. I reckon you're the linkster they talked about so much. They were sure proud the way you helped them. Well, my dear sir, "I am sorry indeed to know of your great loss," I said, extending my hand. "Much obliged, Professor," the old man answered, with dry eyes, but a choke in his voice. "It's a hard thing, sir, to raise a boy, and then for him to be took away to some foreign country and killed, when neither you or him didn't have nary a thing to do with the trouble, and we didn't rightly know what it was all about. But, sir, the worst of it for me is going home and telling the old woman and the boy's woman. She's nursing a babe now that's named for his daddy. That's right. It's a sorry time, sir. It is indeed, my friend, and I'd like to ask you to express to your wife and your son's wife my sympathy in this great sorrow that falls so heavily upon mothers and wives in these troubled times." "That's a good, kind word, mister, and it'll do the women folks a heap of good. They keep talking about you, saying how clever you was to 'em." The canvas-covered wagon rumbled on. The dry eyes of the old man were turned towards the blue hills, and that night 2 mothers would pour down a river of tears to swell the mighty flood of the world's grief. Again there came the thought to me of that telltale letter, the old woman of a fallen soldier, and the young woman of a fatherless babe, that would weep that night, but their tears would just be soft and cleansing, leaving no scars. Any day, though, a chance stranger might break the news that I had deceived them, and its poison would flow into freshly opened wounds to scald and sear past all healing. Many months passed, and there were signs of spring again. On a crisp Saturday morning, I donned my hiking clothes, with a knapsack and a camera slung across my shoulders, and I set out for a day in the hills. In 3 hours, I was in the shadows of the Cherokee Mountain. The state highway from the city had long since installed a fairly good dirt road. Soon it turned into a much more narrow path, and then roughened into a rocky wagon trail that followed along and across a tumbling stream between steep wooden ridges. Here and there, the mountain walls would part far enough for me to frame a bit of the meadow, with a cabin or stable nestled along the foot of the ridge, while scrubby-looking cattle huddled along weathered haystacks. Then the road led upward more sharply, with innumerable windings, until it crossed the top of the main ridge into a sunny gap. I found a tiny spring, so I stopped for an early lunch. Behind and below me in the valley, laid in the hazy sunlight, short stretches of roadway that I had followed were now just yellow streaks against the green forest background. In the distance, I described a white moving object that I could barely see along these yellow streaks. I soon made it out to be a mountaineer's covered wagon coming up toward the gap, and by the time I had eaten my sandwiches and drank my coffee, the rumble of wheels on the rocks could be heard. I sat and waited till the wagon pulled up to the spring. In just a few moments, I recognized instantly the man who was driving. And mountaineers, they never forget a stranger. And he greeted me with the old emotionless tone that I instantly recalled. I walked over to the wagon to make some small talk about the apparent heavy load that he was carrying. And then a shock of revelation came to me. Protruding from the open end of the gate of the short wagon, beneath the canvas top, was the end of a long box, draped with an American flag. "Oh, I see," I gasped. "Is that your son, back from France?" "Yes, mister. I'm bearing him tomorrow." I grasped the old man's hand, and he gripped mine in a way that meant understanding. "How much further you gotta go?" I asked. "Well, it's just a little ways down to the next point. Won't you go home with me? The old woman and the gal would sure be proud to see you, sir." Without a word, I climbed up and I sat beside him. As we neared the journey's end, I could see that my aged companion was becoming ill. His stern manner grew less confident, and it was plain to see that he dreaded the moment of arrival. "You know how women folks is, sir," he said, as if to fortify me and him against the trying scene that he anticipated. "I reckon there'll be a right smart of a crowd there. The old woman's nephew, a young feller who's been attending college there over in Maryville, is there. He's a smart lad, and they say he's going to get his sheepskin next spring. The old women met us at the gate with no outcry or demonstration. To the old man's great relief, they wiped a few tears away with the corners of their aprons. As the neighbor men removed the casket from the box, they laid the flag upon it and they carried it into the house. Both women greeted me cordially, but betrayed not the least surprise to my unexpected presence. A score of neighbors sat quietly on chairs, benches, and beds. The black casket was placed upon 2 chairs in the center of the room. There was no service, no prayer, no preacher. The family and the friends had just come to sit a while with the dead. The young kinsman from the college, an educated-looking young youth, sat at the head of the casket. Virgie's baby, little John, he struggled down from his mother's lap, and he toddled on sturdy but uncertain legs about the room. The grandmother quietly dominated the little group, welcoming newcomers, closing doors, and piling fresh logs on the open fire. When all were seated, she went to the old press in the corner of the room, opened its calico curtain door, and drew from its hidden recess a sadly worn, tinted envelope. "Friends and neighbors," she began in a voice that was calm and steady. "Some of you'uns had heard about a nice letter we got from a French lady while John was on the other side. The professor that's here with us today read it to me and Virgie, and it was as pretty talking as I'd ever heard. It makes us proud of the way John held himself up amongst the best of them when he got over yonder. We've got my sister's boy here from college, and he's learned to read in them foreign tongues while he was away at college. And I'm going to ask him to take this letter and read it to you'uns." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and a sickening horror seized me. My worst fears had been realized, and the tragic undeceiving that was to come on this day of days, the homecoming of the hero's son, now to be turned into a day of confusion and humiliation. I tried to think of something, anything, to prevent the awful thing that was about to happen. I conceived a wild, impossible plan that I might interrupt and make some kind of excuse to call the college boy aside, make some hurried explanation and coach him for the translation. But it was too late. The grandmother skirted across the room to place the letter in the young man's hand. Little John was clinging to her shirt as he whimpered to be taken up. Suddenly, a new thought came to her. "Here, honey," she said gently. "You take this letter over yonder and you give it to your cousin Davy. That's Granny's little man, bless his heart." The guest smiled soberly as the baby, clutching the letter in his hand, began his wobbly journey across the room. In his childish mind, he realized that he had an important mission to perform, but he wasn't exactly sure what was expected of him. Midway through his course, he stopped. He turned back and he looked at his grandmother, who shook her gray head in encouragement. Suddenly, in that moment, a light of understanding shone in the baby's eyes. He took 2 quick steps forward, and he tossed the letter upon the blazing logs in the great stone fireplace. With a cry of dismay, the grandmother started towards the fire, but by the time her stiff joints could respond and her arthritis-ridden hands could seize the tongs, the only thing that was left was the scorched corner of the last page, and it bore the French girl's name, Heloise Bachald. I was on my feet in an instant. My brain was working now, working as if by inspiration. "My dear friends," I said, "I can see you're all distressed, of course, over what has just happened to the letter. Fortunately, I can recall practically every word of it, and I'm going to write it all again in French, just as I read it to my 2 friends more than a year ago, and I know they will wish to keep it, so that this little boy, when he grows into a man, will treasure this memorial of his brave young father who gave his life for a great cause." Soon, the tear-shiny faces of the old women and the young widow went back down with me on the rough journey to my office that afternoon, where I wrote him a new letter, which served as the only and lasting memory of their loved one. And as they left, in the quietness, I sat and I pleaded forgiveness from God. For the rest of my life, I will always wonder what the angels of God have recorded in the big books about me.